The gravel crunched beneath their tires as the young couple pulled into the secluded clearing. It was a warm summer night in 1968, just outside Florence, and Barbara Lacci and her lover Antonio Lo Bianco had found their usual spot. A quiet stretch of countryside where the cypress trees stood like sentinels against the Tuscan sky. They had no idea they were being watched. Inside the car, whispered conversations turned to laughter, then silence. The windows fogged. The crickets sang their evening chorus. Everything seemed perfect, ordinary even. But somewhere in the darkness beyond their headlights, someone was moving closer. What happened next would haunt Italy for nearly 3 decades. At 10:30 p.m., a farmer living nearby heard what he thought were firecrackers. Pop, pop, pop. He went back to his dinner, thinking nothing of it. By morning, 2 bodies would be discovered in that car, riddled with bullets from a .22 Beretta. But the most disturbing detail wasn't the violence itself. It was what the killer had done after. Barbara's 6-year-old son, Natalino, had been asleep in the back seat. When police found him wandering along the road in the early morning hours, his clothes were soaked with his mother's blood. "My mama's dead," he told them, his voice hollow. The child had witnessed something no one should ever see, but what he couldn't tell them was far more terrifying. The killer had let him live. Why? Before we go deeper into this nightmare, I have a question for you. Where are you listening from right now? Are you tucked into bed in New York, Melbourne, or maybe somewhere in Europe? Drop your location in the comments. I love knowing where this story is reaching across the globe. And if you're new here, welcome to the channel. This is where we explore the darkest corners of true crime, told the way they deserve to be told, with respect for the victims and an unflinching look at the truth. Hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss a story. And if you're already part of this community, thank you. Your support means everything. So please give this video a like and share it with someone who appreciates a well-told mystery. Now let's get back to Florence, because that night in 1968 was just the beginning. The investigation into Barbara and Antonio's murders went nowhere fast. Police initially suspected Barbara's husband, Stefano Malvetti, a classic crime of passion. He was arrested, tried, and eventually acquitted. For 6 years, the case went cold, buried in filing cabinets and fading memories. But the killer wasn't finished. He was just waiting. September 14th, 1974. 6 years had passed since that first attack, and Florence had nearly forgotten about the lovers found dead in their car. Then it happened again. Pasquale Gentilcore and Stefania Pettini, both 19 years old, had driven to a secluded spot in the countryside for an evening alone. They parked near an abandoned cemetery, a place where young couples often went seeking privacy. By morning, their bodies told a story of unimaginable horror. The same .22 Beretta had been used, the same methodical execution, but this time the killer had done something new, something that made even hardened investigators turn pale. Stefania's body had been violated after death, stabbed repeatedly in a ritualistic pattern. The killer was escalating, and he was sending a message. Detective Adolfo Izzo stood over the crime scene, his hands trembling as he lit a cigarette. He'd seen murders before. Florence wasn't immune to violence, but this was different. This felt personal, deliberate, almost ceremonial. "We're dealing with someone who enjoys this," he muttered to his partner. "And he's going to do it again." How right he was. But even Izzo couldn't have predicted what was coming. The third attack came in 1981, 7 years later. By now, the Florentine countryside had become a hunting ground, and young couples were the prey. Giovanni Foggi and Carmela Denuccio made the fatal mistake of parking their Fiat on a quiet country road one June evening. The killer approached with the same precision he'd shown before, swift, silent, deadly. The .22 Beretta barked 4 times. But what he did afterward would become his signature, the detail that would earn him his name, Il Mostro di Firenze, the monster of Florence. He mutilated Carmela's body with a surgical precision that suggested knowledge, experience, perhaps even pleasure. He removed parts of her, taking them with him into the night like trophies. This wasn't random violence anymore. This was ritual. The Italian media erupted. Headlines screamed warnings to young lovers. Stay away from the countryside. The monster strikes again. But the most chilling realization was slowly dawning on investigators. When they test-fired the .22 Beretta bullets from all 3 crime scenes, the ballistics matched perfectly. The same gun, the same killer, across 13 years. How many more would die before they caught him? The answer would shock an entire nation. By 1982, Florence was gripped by paranoia. The countryside that had once been a romantic escape had become a place of dread. Yet couples continued to seek privacy in those dark lanes and hidden clearings, perhaps believing that lightning couldn't strike twice in the same place. They were wrong. On June 19, 1982, Paolo Mainardi and Antonella Migliorini became the monster's 4th confirmed victims. Same location pattern, same weapon, same mutilation. The killer was following a script, but whose? His own twisted imagination or something darker? Chief Inspector Silvia Della Monica assembled a task force of 20 detectives. They worked 18-hour days, chasing leads that evaporated like morning fog. They interviewed hundreds of suspects. They staked out lovers' lanes for months. And yet, the monster seemed to know their every move, always one step ahead, always watching. It's like he knows we're coming, one detective complained during a late-night briefing. Like he's listening to our radios. Could the monster be someone close to the investigation? The thought was too terrible to consider, yet it refused to go away. Then came September 9, 1983, and everything changed. Horst Meyer and Uwe Rusch weren't supposed to die that night. They were German tourists, 2 young men traveling through Tuscany in a Volkswagen van. They'd parked in a secluded area to sleep, completely unaware of Florence's dark secret. The monster approached their van in the darkness, expecting to find another young couple. What he found instead would reveal something crucial about his psychology. He opened fire anyway. Horst died instantly. Uwe, wounded, managed to stumble from the van and collapse in the grass, where he bled out beneath the stars. When police arrived at dawn, they found a scene that made no sense. Why would the monster kill 2 men? There had been no mutilation, no ritualistic elements. The murders seemed almost hurried, disappointed. Criminal psychologist Francesco Bruno studied the scene photographs for hours. He made a mistake, Bruno concluded. He thought they were a couple. When he realized they weren't, he panicked. This tells us something important. He needs the woman. The ritual requires her. But why? What was driving this monster to hunt, to kill, to mutilate? The answer would come from the most unlikely source. A letter. Chapter 7. The Monster Speaks. In 1984, Florence newspapers received a package that sent shockwaves through the investigation. Inside was a small piece of flesh, removed from one of the previous victims, and a letter. The monster was communicating. The letter was crude, filled with misspellings and grammatical errors, suggesting someone with limited education. But the message was clear. The monster was proud of his work. He was mocking the police, and he wasn't finished. "You will never catch me," the letter read. "I am everywhere and nowhere. I am the shadow in your countryside, the fear in your hearts." Forensic document analyst Maria Esposito examined the letter under magnification. The handwriting showed signs of stress, pressure points where the pen had nearly torn through the paper. "Whoever wrote this was angry," she noted. "Not just at the police, but at something deeper. This is rage that's been building for years, maybe decades." The task force now faced a terrible question. Were they dealing with one killer, or could there be more? Some investigators believed the killings showed too much consistency to be the work of multiple people. Others pointed to the long gaps between murders, sometimes years, and wondered if the monster was actually several people working together. What they didn't know was that the monster was about to accelerate his timeline, and the next victims would change everything. Pia Rontini and Claudio Stefanaxi were deeply in love. At just 18 and 21, they had their whole lives ahead of them. On the evening of June 29, 1984, They drove Claudio's father's Fiat to a quiet spot in the countryside near Vicchio. They wanted privacy, a few hours away from parents and responsibilities. The monster was waiting. This time, he struck with unprecedented brutality. Both victims were shot multiple times, and Pia's body was subjected to the most extensive mutilation yet. The killer seemed to be refining his technique, taking his time, savoring the act. Police arrived to find a scene so disturbing that several officers requested transfers off the case. But there was something new. Witnesses in the area reported seeing a dark car leaving the scene shortly after the estimated time of death. A Fiat Ritmo, they said, though they couldn't make out the license plate in the darkness. For the first time, police had something concrete. They began searching for every dark Fiat Ritmo in the Florence area. There were thousands. The task seemed impossible, but they had to try, because if they didn't catch the monster soon, he would kill again. And he would do it in less than 2 months. August 1985. Jean-Michel Crevecoeur and Nadine Mauriat were honeymooning in Tuscany, young and in love, soaking in the beauty of the Italian countryside. They pitched their tent in what seemed like a peaceful spot near San Casciano, not knowing they had just entered the monster's territory. On the morning of September 8th, a farmer discovered their bodies. The monster had attacked with his usual precision, the .22 Beretta, the methodical execution. But this time, he'd added a new element to his ritual. He'd left Nadine's body posed in a specific way, almost theatrical, as if he were an artist displaying his work. And he'd taken something. A piece of her, cut with what forensic examiners determined was a sharp blade, possibly a scalpel. The precision of the cut suggested medical knowledge, or at least someone who'd done this many times before. The murder of the French tourists created an international incident. The French government demanded answers. The Italian press turned on the police, accusing them of incompetence. Chief Inspector Della Monica faced calls for his resignation. The pressure was unbearable. In desperation, police arrested Pietro Pacciani, a local farmer with a violent past. He'd killed a traveling salesman years earlier in a jealous rage. He was strange, solitary, known to spy on couples in the countryside. He seemed perfect for the role of monster. But was he, or were the police so desperate for an arrest that they'd convinced themselves of his guilt? The trial of Pietro Pacciani began in 1994, nearly a decade after the last known killing. The courtroom in Florence was packed with journalists, victims' families, and curious onlookers. This was it, the moment Italy had been waiting for. The monster would finally face justice. The prosecution's case seemed strong at first. Pacciani lived near several of the crime scenes. He owned weapons. He had a history of violence. Witnesses testified that he was obsessed with young couples, that he would watch them from the shadows. But then the defense began to poke holes in the case. Where was the .22 Beretta? Never found. Where was the physical evidence linking Pacciani to the crimes? Circumstantial at best. And most damning of all, Pacciani seemed too simple, too unsophisticated to have executed such methodical crimes. Criminal psychologist Bruno took the stand and delivered testimony that sent murmurs through the courtroom. The monster of Florence displays a level of planning and self-control that suggests intelligence, education, and social awareness. Pietro Pacciani, with all due respect, does not fit this profile. Still, on November 1st, 1994, the jury returned a guilty verdict. Pacciani was sentenced to life in prison. The case was closed. Florence could finally breathe again. Except it wasn't over. Not even close. February 1996. In a stunning reversal, an appeals court overturned Pacciani's conviction due to insufficient evidence. He walked free, a broken man who'd spent 2 years in prison for crimes he may not have committed. But the prosecution wasn't finished. If Pacciani didn't act alone, they reasoned, perhaps he'd been part of a group. They arrested 2 of his former friends, Mario Vanni and Giancarlo Lotti, accusing them of being accomplices in the murders. During interrogation, Lotti confessed. He described in graphic detail how he, Vanni, and Pacciani had committed the murders together, how they'd stalked couples, how they'd performed the mutilations. It seemed like the final piece of the puzzle. But something didn't add up. Lottie's confession contained errors, details that didn't match the crime scenes, timelines that didn't work. Some investigators believed he was simply telling the police what they wanted to hear, perhaps in exchange for a lighter sentence. Chief Inspector Ruggero Perugini, who'd taken over the investigation, sat in his office late one night, surrounded by case files and crime scene photos. He'd devoted years of his life to catching the monster, and he still wasn't sure they had the right people. "What if we've been looking at this all wrong?" he asked his deputy. "What if the monster was never one of these men?" The question hung in the air like smoke. If not them, then who? Chapter 12. The Conspiracy Theories. As the case dragged on through the late 1990s and into the 2000s, alternative theories began to emerge. Some investigators believed the murders were connected to a satanic cult, pointing to the ritualistic nature of the mutilations and the way body parts had been removed as if for ceremonial purposes. Author Thomas Harris visited Florence while researching for his novel Hannibal and drew inspiration from the monster case. The idea that a sophisticated, cultured killer could hide in plain sight fascinated him. Was the monster someone respectable, someone above suspicion? Journalist Mario Spizzi and American author Douglas Preston spent years investigating the case independently. Their book, The Monster of Florence, proposed that a group of wealthy, powerful men had orchestrated the killings as part of occult rituals. They suggested the truth had been covered up at the highest levels. For their trouble, both men became targets of the investigation themselves. Preston was nearly arrested. Spizzi was interrogated for hours. The case had become so twisted, so convoluted, that investigators were now chasing the investigators. Meanwhile, Pietro Pacciani died in 2000, taking whatever secrets he had to the grave. Vanni and Lottie remained in prison, still claiming innocence despite Lottie's confession. And the families of the victims were left with more questions than answers. Who had really killed their loved ones? And why? Today, more than 40 years after the last killing, Italy still doesn't know the full truth about the monster of Florence. The official count stands at 16 victims across 8 separate attacks between 1968 and 1985, all killed with the same .22 Beretta, all young couples seeking privacy in the Tuscan countryside. But here's what keeps investigators up at night. The .22 Beretta used in all the killings was traced to a murder in 1968. The very first killing of Barbara Lacci and Antonio Lo Bianco. That gun had been in evidence for years after that initial crime, supposedly secure in a police property room. How did the monster get access to it? Did someone in law enforcement give it to him? Was there a conspiracy within the police force itself? These questions have never been answered. And then there are the gaps in the timeline. Why did the monster wait 6 years between his first and second attacks? Why did he stop completely after 1985? Did he die? Was he arrested for another crime? Or did he simply decide he'd had enough? Some investigators believe the monster is still alive, living somewhere in Italy, an old man now, carrying the weight of 16 murders. Others think he died long ago, his identity lost to time. The truth is, we may never know. The monster of Florence changed Italy forever. The case exposed weaknesses in the Italian judicial system, showed how investigations could be derailed by ego and politics, and demonstrated the dangers of rushing to judgment without solid evidence. For the victims' families, there has never been closure. They've watched as suspect after suspect was paraded before cameras, as theories were proposed and discarded, as the truth seemed to slip further and further away with each passing year. The case also changed how Italians viewed their countryside. Those romantic lanes and secluded clearings, once symbols of youthful freedom and romance, became places of fear. Even today, older Italians remember the warnings. Don't park in the countryside. Don't become the monster's next victim. The psychological impact extended beyond Italy's borders. The case inspired countless books, documentaries, and fictional works. It became a reference point for discussions about serial killers, about the nature of evil, about how someone could commit such horrors and then return to normal life, perhaps sleeping peacefully while the whole country searched for him. Criminologist Alessandro Maluzzi perhaps put it best. The monster of Florence is a mirror held up to Italian society. In trying to find him, we discovered uncomfortable truths about ourselves. So where does that leave us? Sitting here decades later, no closer to the truth than we were in 1968. The most terrifying aspect of the Monster of Florence case isn't the violence, as brutal as it was. It's the uncertainty. It's the knowledge that someone capable of such methodical evil could blend seamlessly into society. Could be anyone, a farmer, a professional, a family man. It's the realization that the person sitting next to you on the bus, the man selling you groceries, the neighbor who waves hello every morning, could be hiding unimaginable darkness inside. The Monster of Florence was never conclusively identified. He may have died without ever facing justice for his crimes. Or he may still be out there, an elderly man now watching documentaries about himself, reading books about his crimes, smiling at how close they came but never quite caught him. 16 young people lost their lives in the Tuscan countryside between 1968 and 1985. They were sons and daughters, lovers and dreamers, people with futures that were violently stolen from them. They deserve justice, and they deserve to be remembered as more than just victims of a monster. The Monster of Florence may never be caught, but these 16 lives will never be forgotten. And somewhere in Italy, the truth still waits to be discovered. If you're new here, welcome to our channel. We specialize in true crime stories told in a calming voice, accompanied by gentle rain, sounds to help you drift off to sleep. If you enjoy tonight's mystery, please consider subscribing to the channel and hitting that notification bell so you never miss a story. And if you're feeling generous, a like on this video helps us tremendously. It tells YouTube to share our content with others who might enjoy it. Feel free to share this with anyone who loves true crime or needs help falling asleep. What time is it where you are? Leave a comment and let me know. There's something comforting about knowing we're all here together, scattered across time zones, but united by our fascination with the unexplained. Now settle in. Get comfortable. Tonight, we're traveling back to December 1919 to the snow-covered streets of Toronto, Canada. This is the story of a man who vanished into thin air on the night of his greatest triumph. A millionaire theater owner who stepped out of his office and was never seen again. Despite one of the most extensive investigations in Canadian history, despite countless theories and suspects, despite a fortune waiting to be claimed, Ambrose Small simply ceased to exist. And the question that has haunted investigators for over a century remains: what happened to Ambrose Small? The snow fell thick and heavy over Toronto on the evening of December 2nd, 1919. It was the kind of snow that muffled sound, that transformed the city into something quieter, more secretive. The streets glistened under the gas lamps, and in the theater district, the marquees blazed with promise. Ambrose Small should have been celebrating. After all, he had just completed the business transaction of his lifetime, the sale of his theater empire for $1.7 million, an astronomical sum in 1919. That's equivalent to roughly $27 million today. He was 56 years old, wealthy beyond measure, and finally free from the daily grind of managing his theatrical holdings across Canada. But those who saw him that day would later remember something troubling in his demeanor. He seemed distracted, perhaps even anxious, though he tried to hide it behind his usual brusque manner. What was weighing on his mind as he walked through his Grand Opera House that afternoon? He had meetings to attend, papers to sign, details to finalize. The sale to the TransCanada Theatre Company had been agreed upon, but there were still loose ends. Money to be transferred, counts to be settled. Ambrose Small was nothing if not meticulous about money. Some would say obsessed with it. He had not become one of the richest men in Toronto by being careless. That afternoon, he had lunch at the Grand Opera House with his lawyer, E.W.M. Flock. They discussed the details of the sale. Small seemed satisfied, even pleased. After lunch, they walked together to the Dominion Bank, where Small deposited a check for $100,000, just a portion of his vast new fortune. The bank manager watched as Small endorsed the check with his distinctive signature, never imagining it would be one of the last times anyone saw Ambrose Small conduct business. But something happened after that bank visit. Something that would change everything. Because when Small returned to his office at the Grand Opera House, he made a decision that would puzzle investigators for decades. What did he do in those final hours before he vanished? To understand what happened to Ambrose Small, you must first understand who he was. And Ambrose Small was not a man who inspired lukewarm feelings. People either admired his business acumen or despised his ruthlessness. There was no middle ground. Born in 1863 to a middle-class family in Bradford, Ontario, Ambrose showed an early aptitude for business. But it was in the theater industry that he found his calling. By the 1890s, he was acquiring theaters across Ontario, building an empire that would eventually span the entire country. He owned the Grand Opera House in Toronto, the Grand Theatre in London, theaters in Hamilton, Kingston, Peterborough, and beyond. He was known as a hard bargainer, someone who squeezed every penny from his investments. His theaters were profitable, but not because he was generous. Performers complained about his low wages. Employees whispered about his temper. He had a reputation for being difficult, demanding, and utterly uncompromising. His marriage to Teresa Corman in 1902 had been seen by Toronto society as something of a surprise. Teresa came from a wealthy Catholic family, well-educated and cultured. She was everything Ambrose was not: refined, devout, patient. Why she married him remained a topic of speculation in Toronto's drawing rooms. Some said it was for family business connections. Others suggested that Teresa saw something in Ambrose that others missed, some hidden depth beneath his harsh exterior. But by 1919, the marriage had grown cold. They lived together in their mansion at 103 Glen Road in Rosedale, Toronto's most prestigious neighborhood, but they lived separate lives. Ambrose was rarely home. He spent his evenings at his theaters, his nights at his private clubs, often in the company of women who were not his wife. And then there was his secretary, John Dowdy, a quiet, efficient man who had worked for Small for years, handling the endless details of the theater business. Dowdy knew everything about Small's affairs, business and otherwise. He knew where the money went, who owed Small money, and who Small owed. He was privy to secrets that others could only guess at. On that December evening in 1919, Dowdy was still at the Grand Opera House. He would be one of the last people to see Ambrose Small alive. But what passed between them in those final hours would become the subject of intense scrutiny. Because by the next morning, both men would be gone from Toronto, and only one would ever return. After returning from the bank at approximately 3:30 p.m., Ambrose Small entered his office on the ground floor of the Grand Opera House. The building was bustling with the usual afternoon activity. Stagehands preparing for the evening performance, box office clerks counting receipts, actors arriving for makeup calls. Small's office was located just off the main lobby, a modest room that belied his wealth. Unlike many successful men of his era, Small did not believe in ostentatious displays. His desk was practical, his furnishings functional. What mattered to him was what the ledger said, not how the office looked. John Dowdy followed him into the office. They had business to discuss, always more business. Small's secretary was a man of about 35, thin and nervous in manner, with spectacles that he constantly adjusted. He had been with Small long enough to anticipate his moods, to know when to speak and when to remain silent. What they discussed in that office has never been fully established. Later, Dowdy would tell investigators that they reviewed various financial matters related to the sale. There were bonds to be transferred, accounts to be reconciled. It was routine work, or so Dowdy claimed. But there was something else happening that afternoon, something that wouldn't come to light immediately. Small received a telephone call around 5 p.m. Who was on the other end of that call? Dowdy said he didn't know. Small took the call privately, asking his secretary to step out of the office. When Dowdy returned a few minutes later, Small seemed agitated. He was pacing, something he did when troubled. Shortly after 5:30 p.m., Ambrose Small put on his overcoat and hat. He told Dowdy he was going to the Grand Theatre on Adelaide Street, another of his properties, to check on something. Dowdy offered to accompany him, but Small declined. He said he would return within the hour. The stage doorman, a man named Thomas Small, no relation, watched as Ambrose Small walked out into the snowy evening. He turned west on Adelaide Street and disappeared into the crowds of shoppers and theatergoers heading home for dinner. Thomas Small was certain of what he saw, because he checked his watch. It was 5:45 p.m. exactly. He had no reason to believe it was significant at the time. After all, Ambrose Small came and went from his theaters at all hours. There was nothing unusual about it. Except that this time, Ambrose Small never came back. And when investigators tried to trace his movements after he left that door, they discovered something that would deepen the mystery immeasurably. Several witnesses claimed to have seen Small that evening, but their accounts contradicted each other in ways that made no sense. Where did Ambrose Small go after leaving the Grand Opera House? Teresa Small was not immediately concerned when her husband didn't come home that night. This was not unusual behavior for Ambrose. He often stayed late at one of his theaters or spent the night at his club. Their marriage had evolved into an arrangement of mutual tolerance. She managed the household and her social obligations. He managed his business and his diversions. They had learned not to question each other too closely. But when December 3rd arrived and there was still no word from Ambrose, Teresa began to feel the first stirrings of unease. She telephoned the Grand Opera House. John Dowdy answered. No, he told her Mr. Small had not been in that morning. He had left the previous evening around 5:45 and hadn't returned. Did he say where he was going? Teresa asked. Dowdy hesitated. He said he was going to check on something at the Grand Theater, but I don't know if he actually went there. The Grand Theater. Teresa called there next. No, the manager told her Mr. Small had not been there the previous evening. No one had seen him. Now the unease blossomed into something sharper. Teresa Small was a pragmatic woman, not given to panic or dramatics, but she knew her husband's habits. Even when he was conducting his various affairs, even when he was gambling at his clubs, he always checked in eventually. He was compulsive about his businesses, about knowing what was happening at each of his theaters. For him to simply vanish without a word to anyone was unthinkable. She called his lawyer EWM Flock. Had he heard from Ambrose? No, Flock said, not since their lunch the previous day. He sounded puzzled. They had just completed a massive sale. Surely Small would want to follow up on the details. Teresa spent December 3rd making calls, checking with anyone who might have seen or heard from her husband, his club, his business associates, the managers of his various theaters. No one had seen him. No one had heard from him. It was as if Ambrose Small had stepped out of the Grand Opera House and stepped out of existence. On the morning of December 4th, Teresa Small did something she would never have done under normal circumstances. She went to the police. Detective Inspector George Kennedy of the Toronto Police received her in his office at City Hall. He listened as she described her husband's disappearance, making notes in his careful hand. When she finished, he looked up at her with an expression she couldn't quite read. Mrs. Small, he said slowly, I need to ask you something directly. Is it possible your husband simply left? That he decided to start a new life somewhere else? Teresa stiffened. Without his fortune? Without access to his bank accounts? Inspector, my husband just sold his business for $1.7 million. Why would he walk away from that? It was a fair question. And it was that question that would transform Ambrose Small's disappearance from a missing person case into something far more sinister. Because as Inspector Kennedy began his investigation, he would discover that the money from the sale had never been properly deposited. And John Dowdy, the loyal secretary who knew all of Small's secrets, had also disappeared. Inspector Kennedy was a methodical man, respected throughout the Toronto Police for his thoroughness. He had solved numerous cases through patient investigation and attention to detail. But even he had to admit that the disappearance of Ambrose Small presented unusual challenges from the very beginning. His first action was to visit the Grand Opera House. He interviewed the staff, starting with the stage doorman who had seen Small leave on the evening of December 2nd. The man was certain of the time, 5:45 p.m., and certain of the direction Small had walked. West on Adelaide Street. Kennedy then asked to speak with John Dowdy. That's when he learned something that immediately elevated his concern. Dowdy had not been seen since December 2nd either. He had left the Grand Opera House shortly after Small, telling another employee he was going home. But when Kennedy sent officers to Dowdy's boarding house, the landlady reported that Dowdy had packed a bag and left on December 3rd, saying he was going to visit family. Did he say which family? Kennedy asked. No, the landlady replied, and I didn't ask. He paid his rent through the month, so I had no reason to question him. This was troubling, very troubling. Kennedy returned to the Grand Opera House and requested access to Small's office and files. What he found there would transform the investigation into something far more complex. The financial records were in disarray. Papers were missing. And most significantly, when Kennedy examined the books related to the theater sale, he discovered significant discrepancies. The sale had been for $1.7 million. Of that, $1 million had been in the form of a check which Small had deposited, or at least part of which he had deposited, on December 2nd. But the bonds that made up the remainder of the sale were missing. Bonds worth $700,000, negotiable and as good as cash if one knew how to handle them properly. John Dowdy, as Small's secretary, would have known exactly how to handle them. Kennedy sat in Small's office, staring at the empty spaces in the filing cabinets, and felt a cold certainty settle over him. This was not a simple disappearance. This was either a theft that had somehow gone terribly wrong or something far worse. But which was it? Had Dowdy stolen the bonds and fled, possibly killing Small to prevent discovery? Or had Small orchestrated his own disappearance, planning to blame Dowdy for the missing money? Or was there a third possibility, something Kennedy hadn't yet considered? He needed to find John Dowdy. That much was clear. Kennedy issued a bulletin to police departments across Canada and the United States. John Dowdy, age 35, thin build, wears spectacles, wanted for questioning in connection with the disappearance of Ambrose Small and the theft of negotiable bonds worth $700,000. The manhunt had begun. But what Kennedy didn't yet know was that finding Dowdy would only deepen the mystery, not solve it. Because when they finally tracked him down, Dowdy would tell a story that explained everything and nothing, that answered questions while raising even more troubling ones. Within days of Teresa Small's report, the disappearance of Ambrose Small became front-page news across Canada. The Toronto newspapers ran sensational headlines: "Millionaire theater owner vanishes. Secretary flees with fortune." The story had everything the public craved: wealth, mystery, possible betrayal, and the tantalizing question of whether a prominent man could simply disappear without a trace. Inspector Kennedy assembled a team of detectives and began a systematic investigation. They retraced Small's movements on December 2nd with meticulous care. The lunch with lawyer E.W.M. Flock, confirmed. The visit to the Dominion Bank to deposit the check, confirmed. The return to the Grand Opera House around 3:30 p.m., confirmed. The departure at 5:45 p.m., confirmed by the stage doorman. But after that, the trail became confused. A shopkeeper on Adelaide Street claimed to have seen Small walking west around 6 p.m. A cab driver reported picking up a man matching Small's description near the Grand Theatre around 6:30 p.m. and dropping him at Union Station. But the station master at Union Station had no record of Small purchasing a ticket, and none of the railway porters remembered seeing him. Other witnesses came forward with conflicting accounts. A woman claimed to have seen Small entering a restaurant on King Street around 7 p.m. A man insisted he'd seen Small getting into an automobile with two other men near the waterfront. Each lead was investigated. Each lead went nowhere. Kennedy expanded the search to Small's personal life. He interviewed Teresa Small again, this time asking more probing questions about her husband's habits, his associates, his enemies. Teresa was remarkably forthcoming, displaying none of the defensiveness one might expect from a wife whose husband's infidelities were about to become public knowledge. "Inspector," she said during one interview, "I'm not naive about my husband's character. He was not an easy man to live with. He had affairs, I knew about them. He gambled, I knew about that too. He had business rivals who disliked him intensely, but he was not a man who would abandon his fortune. Money was everything to Ambrose. Everything. So if he's missing, it's not by choice. Can you think of anyone who might have wanted to harm him? Kennedy asked. Teresa considered this carefully. Inspector, my husband drove hard bargains. He foreclosed on people who couldn't pay their debts. He evicted tenants. He fired employees without much ceremony. In business, he made many enemies. But murderous enemies? I honestly don't know. Kennedy's team began compiling a list of people who might have had grievances against Small. The list grew disturbingly long. Former business partners who felt cheated. Theater managers he'd fired. Actors he'd blacklisted. Landlords whose properties he'd acquired through foreclosure. Some of these people had made threats against Small, according to witnesses. But threats were one thing. Following through was another. Meanwhile, the search for John Dowdy continued. Kennedy had officers checking train stations, interviewing ticket agents, showing Dowdy's photograph. The secretary had vanished as completely as his employer. But unlike Small, Dowdy had left traces. He had withdrawn money from his bank account on December 3rd, a significant sum of $2,000. He had told his landlady he was leaving. He had been seen boarding a train at Union Station heading west. On December 10th, Kennedy received a telegram that made his pulse quicken. Police in Detroit had detained a man matching Dowdy's description. Kennedy immediately arranged to travel to Detroit. Could this be the break he needed? Would Dowdy's capture finally solve the mystery of what happened to Ambrose Small? The man sitting in the Detroit police interrogation room looked exhausted and frightened. John Dowdy had been arrested at a boarding house in Detroit's downtown district, recognized by an alert landlady who had seen his photograph in the newspaper. He had offered no resistance when the police came for him. Inspector Kennedy entered the room and sat down across from Dowdy. For a long moment, the two men simply looked at each other. Dowdy was the first to speak. "I didn't kill him," he said. His voice was barely above a whisper. "I swear to you, Inspector, I didn't kill Ambrose Small." "Then why did you run?" Kennedy asked calmly. Dowdy removed his spectacles and rubbed his eyes. "Because I knew how it would look. The bonds are missing. Mr. Small is missing. And I'm his secretary. I had access to everything. Who would believe me?" "Why don't you tell me what happened?" Kennedy suggested. "Start from the beginning." And so John Dowdy began to tell his story. It was a story that would be examined and re-examined by investigators for years to come. A story that some believed and others rejected as an elaborate lie. But it was all Kennedy had to work with. According to Dowdy, the afternoon of December 2nd had been routine until that mysterious phone call around 5 p.m. Small had taken the call privately, and when Dowdy re-entered the office, Small seemed agitated. He gave Dowdy instructions to handle some paperwork, then announced he was going to the Grand Theater. "Did he say why?" Kennedy asked. "No. He just said he needed to check on something. I asked if he wanted me to come along, but he said no. That wasn't unusual. Mr. Small often went to the theaters alone." "What time did he leave?" "About 5:45. I watched him walk out the front entrance. And then I finished the paperwork he'd asked me to handle. Took about 30 minutes. Then I locked up his office and went home. I lived in a boarding house on Jarvis Street. It was only a 10-minute walk." "Did you see Small again after he left the office?" "No. That was the last time I saw him." Kennedy leaned forward. "Mr. Dowdy, I need you to be very honest with me now. What happened to the bonds from the theater sale?" This was the crucial question. The missing $700,000 in negotiable bonds. Dowdy's answer would determine whether he was charged with theft, murder, or both.
Dooft hij met Kennedy's case?
"I took them," he said. The room fell silent. Kennedy felt his instincts proved correct. Dowdy was a thief. But was he also a killer? "Why did you take them?" Kennedy asked. "Because Mr. Small told me to." This was unexpected. Kennedy sat back, studying Doughty's face for any sign of deception. Explain that. Doughty's explanation was both simple and complicated. According to him, Ambrose Small had given him specific instructions regarding the bonds on the morning of December 2nd, before the lunch with Lawyer Flock. Mr. Small was worried, Doughty said. He told me that Mrs. Small had been asking questions about the sale, about the money. He said he wanted to keep some of the proceeds separate, where she couldn't access them. He wanted to hide assets from his wife? Kennedy asked. Not hide exactly, more like defer. He said he would tell her about the bonds eventually, but he wanted time to decide how to handle them. He asked me to hold on to them for a few weeks while he sorted things out. Kennedy considered this. It was plausible. Wealthy men often tried to shield assets from their wives, especially if divorce was being contemplated. But it was also convenient for Doughty to claim he had permission to take the bonds. Where are the bonds now? Kennedy asked. In my bag, at the boarding house where you arrested me. This at least proved to be true. Detroit police had found the bonds exactly where Doughty said they would be. All $700,000 worth. None of them cashed or negotiated. If Doughty had stolen the bonds intending to abscond with them, why hadn't he tried to convert them to cash? Why had he simply kept them in his possession? Kennedy pressed on. Walk me through December 2nd again. You say Small left around 5:45. What did you do after that? I worked until about 6:15, finishing the paperwork. Then I locked up and walked home. I ate dinner at a restaurant on Young Street, a place called Morrison's Cafe. I go there often. Then I went back to my boarding house and went to bed. What about December 3rd? I woke up early and went to the Grand Opera House around 8 a.m. Mr. Small wasn't there. I asked if anyone had heard from him. No one had. I tried calling his house. Mrs. Small said he hadn't come home. That's when I started to worry. Why did you worry? You said Small often stayed out all night. Yes, but never without telling someone where he could be reached. And never on the day after completing such a massive business transaction. There would be follow-up work to do. It wasn't like him to simply disappear. So what did you do? Doughty shifted uncomfortably in his chair. I waited at the office all morning. By noon, I was genuinely frightened. I kept thinking about those bonds in my desk drawer. If something had happened to Mr. Small, and the bonds were found in my possession, I knew how it would look. So you decided to run. Not immediately. First, I tried to think rationally. I told myself Small would show up any moment with some explanation. But by evening, when there was still no word, I panicked. I went home, packed a bag, withdrew money from my bank, and took the next train heading west. I know it was foolish. I know it makes me look guilty, but I was terrified. Kennedy studied Doughty's face. The man seemed sincere, but sincerity could be faked. The story had a ring of truth to it, but it also had convenient gaps. And it didn't answer the fundamental question. What had happened to Ambrose Small? Mr. Doughty, Kennedy said carefully. Did you kill Ambrose Small?
No.
Do you know who did? I don't know that anyone killed him. Then where is he? Doughty shook his head helplessly. I don't know, Inspector. I wish I did. Kennedy had Doughty extradited back to Toronto, where he was charged with theft of the bonds. The charge of murder was held in abeyance, without a body, without any evidence of violence. It was difficult to prove that Small was even dead, much less that Doughty had killed him. But Doughty's arrest did not bring the closure that everyone hoped for. If anything, it deepened the mystery. Because if Doughty was telling the truth about the bonds, then what had happened after Small left the Grand Opera House that snowy December evening? As the investigation dragged on through December and into January 1920, public fascination with the case only intensified. The newspapers ran daily updates, each more speculative than the last. Small's body found in Lake Ontario, one headline screamed, only to be retracted the next day. Millionaire spotted in New York, another claimed, based on a dubious witness account. Into this atmosphere of speculation and sensation stepped a woman named Mabel Rogers, who claimed to be a spiritualist medium. Rogers approached the police in mid-January with an extraordinary claim. She had received a vision from the spirit realm about Ambrose Small's fate. Inspector Kennedy was skeptical, but he was also desperate. Despite weeks of investigation, despite interviewing hundreds of witnesses, despite following every lead, he was no closer to finding Small than he had been on December 4th. So when Mrs. Rogers offered her services, Kennedy agreed to hear her out, though he did so privately, away from the newspapers. "Mr. Small is dead," Rogers announced dramatically during their meeting. "His spirit came to me 3 nights ago. He was agitated, troubled. He wants his body to be found." "Where is the body?" Kennedy asked, playing along. "In his own theater, the Grand Opera House. He's been there all along, hidden in a place where no one thought to look." This was disturbing. Kennedy had ordered searches of all of Small's theaters in the first week of the investigation, but they had been cursory, looking for obvious signs of foul play, not conducting a thorough forensic examination. Could Small's body actually be hidden somewhere in the Grand Opera House? "Can you be more specific?" Kennedy asked. Rogers closed her eyes, as if receiving a transmission from beyond. "Beneath the stage, in the old storage areas. There are tunnels there, aren't there? Places that haven't been accessed in years." This was true. The Grand Opera House had been built in the 1870s and had a complex basement system that included old storage rooms and maintenance tunnels. Some of these areas had been sealed off decades ago. Despite his skepticism, Kennedy authorized a thorough search of the Grand Opera House basement. Teams of officers spent days in the dark, dusty spaces beneath the stage, using lanterns to explore every corner, every sealed room. They found old stage props, forgotten costume pieces, ancient playbills. But they did not find Ambrose Small's body. Kennedy thanked Mrs. Rogers for her time and showed her out. The medium's prediction had proven false, as he'd expected. But the search hadn't been entirely wasted. It had at least ruled out one possibility. However, Mrs. Rogers was not the only psychic to involve herself in the case. Over the following weeks, several other mediums came forward with their own visions and predictions. One claimed Small had been murdered and thrown into Toronto Harbor. Another said he'd been taken by boat to Cleveland and murdered there. A third insisted he was still alive, being held prisoner in a remote farmhouse north of the city. These claims might have been dismissed as the work of attention seekers if not for one troubling detail. Some of the mediums described elements of Small's disappearance that had not been made public. How they knew these details remains a mystery. Were they truly receiving information from beyond? Or had they somehow gained access to police files? Kennedy never discovered the answer. But the involvement of the spiritualists had one significant effect. It shifted public perception of the case. Increasingly, people began to accept that Ambrose Small was dead, even though no body had been found. The question was no longer, where is Ambrose Small? But rather, who killed Ambrose Small? While Inspector Kennedy pursued leads and interrogated witnesses, Teresa Small faced her own nightmare. With her husband missing and her financial affairs in chaos, she found herself in an impossible situation. The theater empire had been sold, but the proceeds were tied up in the investigation. The bonds were being held as evidence. Her husband's bank accounts were frozen pending resolution of the case. She had money of her own. Ambrose had been generous in that regard, maintaining separate accounts for household expenses. But maintaining the mansion in Rosedale, paying the staff, dealing with lawyers and accountants, all of it was draining her resources quickly. And then there was the suspicion. Some people whispered that Teresa knew more than she was saying. Some suggested she might have been involved in her husband's disappearance. After all, hadn't she stood to inherit everything if Ambrose was declared dead? Didn't she have more motive than anyone? Inspector Kennedy did not seriously suspect Teresa. He had interviewed her extensively and found her responses consistent and credible. But he understood why others might have doubts. A missing wealthy husband, a wife who admitted their marriage was troubled, money that couldn't be accounted for. It was the stuff of crime novels. What most people didn't understand was how little Teresa actually benefited from her husband's disappearance. Under the law, Ambrose could not be declared legally dead for 7 years. Until then, his estate would remain in limbo, inaccessible to Teresa or anyone else. She couldn't sell properties, couldn't access his accounts, couldn't make any significant financial decisions. In February 1920, Teresa made a decision that surprised many observers. She hired private investigators to supplement the police investigation. The firm she retained was Hanley and Davies, one of the most respected detective agencies in Canada. She gave them a simple mandate: find out what happened to my husband. The private investigators brought fresh eyes to the case. They re-interviewed witnesses, examined the financial records more carefully, and began investigating angles that the police had perhaps overlooked. One of their early focuses was on Ambrose Small's personal relationships. Not just his business associates, but his friends, his club memberships, his romantic entanglements. What they discovered was that in the months before his disappearance, Small had been involved with a woman named Clara Smith, an actress who had performed at several of his theaters. The relationship had been brief but intense, according to friends of both parties. It had ended in October 1919, about 6 weeks before Small's disappearance. The private investigators tracked down Clara Smith and interviewed her extensively. Yes, she admitted she had been involved with Ambrose Small. Yes, the relationship had ended badly. Small had made promises he didn't keep. Promises about roles in his theaters, about financial support. When Clara pressed him, he'd cut her off entirely. Was I angry? Clara said. Yes, I was furious. He used me and then discarded me like I was nothing. But did I kill him? Inspector, I was performing in Montreal on December 2nd. There are dozens of witnesses who can confirm that. Her alibi checked out. Clara Smith had been on stage at the His Majesty's Theatre in Montreal at the exact time Ambrose Small was last seen leaving the Grand Opera House in Toronto. She couldn't possibly have been involved. But the revelation of the affair opened up new questions. Had Clara told someone about her treatment by Small? Did she have a friend or lover who might have decided to take revenge on her behalf? The private investigators pursued this line of inquiry, but it led nowhere. Clara's associates had alibis. There was no evidence connecting any of them to Small's disappearance. In March 1920, John Doughty went on trial for theft of the negotiable bonds. The case attracted enormous public attention. The courtroom was packed every day with spectators eager to hear testimony about the mysterious disappearance. The Crown's case was straightforward. Doughty had taken bonds worth $700,000 without permission and had fled when Small went missing. His story about Small asking him to hold the bonds was uncorroborated and implausible. He was clearly guilty of theft and probably guilty of much worse. Doughty's defense attorney, a skilled lawyer named Marcus Webb, argued that his client had been following his employer's instructions. Small had wanted to keep assets away from his wife, a common enough practice among wealthy men. Doughty had panicked and fled, yes, but that was because he knew he would be suspected, not because he was actually guilty of anything beyond poor judgment. My client is guilty of cowardice, Webb told the jury. He is guilty of running away instead of facing the music, but he is not guilty of theft, and he is most certainly not guilty of whatever fate befell Ambrose Small. The trial lasted 3 weeks. Witnesses testified about Doughty's character. Some said he was honest and hardworking. Others suggested he resented Small and had spoken bitterly about his employer. Financial experts examined the bonds and the paper continues 6:19 Peam Trail around the theater sale. Inspector Kennedy testified about the investigation and Doughty's arrest in Detroit. But the most compelling testimony came from Teresa Small. She took the stand in early April, dressed in black, her face composed but tired. The courtroom fell silent as she was sworn in. Under questioning by the Crown, she confirmed that she had been asking her husband about the details of the theater sale. Yes, she had wanted to know how the money would be handled. Yes, Ambrose had been evasive about it. Did your husband ever mention giving bonds to John Doughty for safekeeping? The prosecutor asked. No, Teresa said firmly. He never mentioned anything like that to me, but under cross-examination by defense attorney Webb, Teresa admitted something significant. Mrs. Small, Webb asked. Is it possible your husband made arrangements you knew nothing about? Of course it's possible, Teresa replied. Ambrose kept many things from me. Is it possible he wanted to keep financial assets separate from you? Teresa hesitated, then nodded. Yes, that's possible. This admission gave the jury pause. If even Teresa Small believed her husband might have been hiding assets, perhaps Doughty's story wasn't as implausible as it seemed. After days of deliberation, the jury returned a surprising verdict: not guilty of theft. They believed there was reasonable doubt about whether Doughty had taken the bonds without permission. However, the judge made it clear that Doughty was not being exonerated of all suspicion. He was released from custody, but the bonds were returned to Teresa Small, and Doughty left the courthouse to face a hostile public that largely believed he had gotten away with something. But if Doughty hadn't killed Small, then who had? Or was Small even dead? With Doughty acquitted and no new leads emerging, the investigation into Ambrose Small's disappearance entered a new phase. Inspector Kennedy stepped back from active day-to-day work on the case, though it remained officially open. The private investigators hired by Teresa Small continued their work, but they too were running out of fresh angles to pursue. In this vacuum, theories proliferated. The newspapers ran elaborate speculation pieces, each proposing different scenarios for what might have happened to Toronto's missing millionaire. Theory 1. Small had staged his own disappearance. Perhaps he was tired of his life, his marriage, his business pressures. Perhaps he wanted to start fresh somewhere new, under a different name. The sale of his theaters had provided him with the perfect opportunity. He could take the cash, fake his disappearance, and reinvent himself elsewhere. Proponents of this theory pointed out that no body had been found, no evidence of violence discovered. Maybe Small was living quietly in South America or Europe, laughing at the fuss he'd left behind. But this theory had significant problems. Why would Small abandon $1.7 million? Why leave the bonds with Doughty? And why stage the disappearance so close to completing the biggest business deal of his life? It made no sense. Theory 2. Small had been murdered by a business rival or someone he'd wronged. The list of people who had grievances against Small was long. Perhaps one of them had finally snapped, confronted Small on the evening of December 2nd, and killed him in a fit of rage. The body could have been hidden anywhere, buried in a remote location, dumped in Lake Ontario, concealed in one of Toronto's many construction sites. This theory seemed plausible, but investigators couldn't identify any specific suspect with both motive and opportunity. Everyone on Kennedy's list of potential enemies had been investigated, and none of them could be definitively placed near Small on that crucial evening. Theory 3. Small had been killed by organized criminals. In 1919, Prohibition was just beginning in Canada, and criminal organizations were becoming more sophisticated and violent. Perhaps Small had gotten involved with the wrong people, gambling debts, protection rackets, some scheme that had gone wrong. Perhaps he'd been killed as a message. But again, there was no evidence. No underworld figures had been connected to Small. No one from Toronto's criminal element had been seen near the Grand Opera House on December 2nd. In May 1920, a new theory emerged that captured public attention more than any of the others. A journalist named Patrick Sullivan published an article suggesting that Ambrose Small was being held prisoner somewhere, possibly by anarchists or revolutionaries who planned to ransom him. Sullivan pointed to the political unrest of the era, labor strikes, communist agitation, the Red Scare that was sweeping across North America. Perhaps Small, as a wealthy capitalist, had been targeted for kidnapping. This theory gained traction because it explained why no body had been found and why there had been no demand for ransom.